in a state of serious passenger crime.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm here with Dr. CAROLYN J. Eichner, author of Surmounting the Barricades, Women and the Paris Commune, Feminism Empire, and the Paris Commune, A Brief History. And those last two books have been released this year, I think.
Yes.
So that's exciting. I was going to ask you, as you teach in the Women and Gender Studies department at University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, how did you get into studying revolutionary France from the perspective of gender? That's not immediately obvious.
Okay. So I teach in both history and women's and gender studies. So I'm 50-50 appointed. And my PhD is in modern French history from UCLA. And my route to studying this was kind of circuitous. I was raised a feminist. I was always interested in feminist issues. I was kind of a non-directed youth and ended up with a bachelor's degree in finance, which I didn't like and I wasn't good at. I was really, and worked in marketing and it was not good. And so ultimately through, a number of fortunate things, I was able to go back to school. And my first semester, I had a class on Marx, a class on modern Europe, and a class on absolutism in France. And in the modern Europe class, the thing I noticed was the number of revolutions in France in the 19th century, which I had not, I just didn't know. And I became particularly interested in the Commune. And I also noticed that, it's like, where are the women in all of this? So this is the late 80s. And so the scholarship was pretty nil. And it just, I wrote my master's thesis on the Union des Femmes and then wrote my dissertation on what ultimately became Surmounting the Barricades. So it brought together, a lifelong interest in feminism and a kind of what had been before that, a general interest in history, but without a recognition that one could have a career in it. And then I was really lucky to be able to go back and find something that I loved and that I could do pretty well.
Yeah. So one of the things that I also have taught history both at the college level and at the high school level, although I mostly teach English. I always find that my students are surprised about how many revolutions there were in France. And I think that's partly just the unfortunate naming convention of the French Revolution. So people think there's one, as opposed to like five. So for my audience members who may not know, what is the specific context of the Paris Commune and the revolution/civil war of 1871? And why is the period so particularly opaque in English source material?
Okay. Yeah. Well, when I talk about, the Paris Commune, I say, a revolution in France, not the big one, because exactly as you said, there's this assumption that is it. So the Paris Commune is a revolutionary civil war at the tail end of the Franco-Prussian War. So France was under what was known as the Second Empire from the 1850s until 1870, and that's Louis Napoleon was the emperor. That's Napoleon's nephew. And it was a time of kind of a capitalist boom, but real limitation on freedoms of speech, association, the press, etc. And near the end, Louis Napoleon was losing popularity, etc., and did a number of things to try to regain that popularity, including going to war with Prussia, or being sort of fooled into going to war with Prussia, and then being he was actually captured on the battlefield. It was, it didn't go well. And so during this time period, and this the years building up into this, there was an increase. There was a growth of socialist movements and feminism and anarchism in France, and it was, primarily more clandestine until the last few years, beginning in 1868, when there was an expansion in freedom of the press, association, and speech. And then in that time period, that was really when left progressive, what we would call progressive movements, flourished. And so when France goes to war with Prussia and then loses, and Napoleon gets captured on the battlefield, the empire falls and the republic is declared, and people think that this is, now going to be a time of egalitarian ness. And it is not. There's a pretty repressive kind of temporary government put into place, and then fairly quickly France surrenders to Prussia because the French government is more concerned with the working class people of Paris than they are with the Prussians, because they are afraid of another revolution, because there had been one, 1848, 1830, big one. And so they put in a number of repressive measures, and the people in the working class people in Paris were increasingly unhappy with this, and these measures were meant to be kind of economic and social attacks on the working class. And so there were cannons left in Paris at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and the working class people had been patriotic and actually supported the war and donated money for the cannons and felt that these cannons were theirs. And so at this point in the spring of 1871, the groups of working class men and women and children dragged these cannons up into Montmartre, which is an area in the north of Paris that was very much working class. It was also up on a butte overlooking the city, and they had the cannons there looking out over the city. This did not sit well with the French government, and so they made this plan to get the cannons, and before dawn on March 18th, they sent soldiers up there. They didn't send the horses right away, and so the soldiers waited, and when the sun came up, the women started coming out of their houses to get milk and bread for their families, and saw the soldiers and said, what are you doing here? what is going on? And spoke with them, stepped between the soldiers and the cannons, and the soldiers fraternized, and the revolution was made. And so that is, how it happened in this period.
So one question that comes immediately in regards to this is women's role in this revolution, as your story actually hints, is important from the beginning, but it's not generally well understood. I think even less well understood than it is in like the big French Revolution, in quotes. What is the state of gender relations, and what kinds of gender and sex struggles are going on in 1871?
Well, France is under the Napoleonic Code of Law, which was put in place by Napoleon, and it's a law code that is exceedingly patriarchal and misogynist. Women, adult married women, have the same legal status as children. They have no legal autonomy. They have no bodily autonomy, married women. And so, in this context, there's a growth of feminist movements, and that's plural, movements. And feminisms had developed in the French Revolution and had continued in, sort of under various forms throughout the 19th century. And coming up to this time in the Commune, as I mentioned before, in the 1860s, in this time of dissatisfaction with the empire, there was the growth of socialism, anarchism, and different types of feminisms. So the kind of what we would call a liberal feminism and bourgeois feminism was trying to change the system within the existing structure, the existing political and socio-political structure. So trying to change laws, basically, to make them more egalitarian. But then there were multiple socialist feminisms, ranging from anarchist feminism, socialist feminisms, revolutionary socialist feminisms, or more gradualist Republican socialist feminisms, and not Republican in the American political party sense, but in the sense of advocating a democratically elected government, a representative government, or a republic. And so there were these different kinds of movements to either try and ameliorate women's condition within the existing structure or overthrow it. And so these all, like, once the commune happens, there's really no presence of liberal feminism. As a matter of fact, the communard women were not interested in getting the vote. They were just not interested in suffrage, because they believed that the commune was the beginning of the new world and that everything was going to be rebuilt. And so why waste energy and political capital on getting a vote in a system that is coming down? And the commune, I mean, and I talk about this later, the commune itself was very much of a experiment in direct democracy. And there were many other ways to have a political voice and a political impact besides voting. So you have this real range of feminisms in the 19th century, and that's something that has very much been kind of written out of history. And that's something I talk about in my first book, in Surmounting the Barricades. And you're right, there's much more attention to women and gender in the French Revolution. There's more scholarship on the French Revolution in general. I mean, there's a lot of scholarship on the Paris Commune, but much more on the French Revolution. And so there's been, just almost by force of numbers, there's been more attention to women and gender. And actually, I just realized I didn't answer the second part of your second question about why it's so opaque. The commune's opaque in Anglophone world. And I mean, it's really a question of, I think, a pretty poor history education in the United States and a kind of general American ocentrism. And I don't think we learn much about the histories of other countries. And the commune especially is something, because it is so politicized. It kind of, it's the vast majority of people I speak to in the United States who are not historians or historical anthropologists or something don't know what it is.
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually when I was thinking about why in the United States I can't count on any general history knowledge, even of American history, but after American, I can pretty much count on some British, and that's about it. And I find that fascinating because I've always thought the French experience was more parallel to ours in many ways than the British, even though culturally, linguistically, etc., we come out of Britain politically anyway. But and that lack of knowledge is, sometimes a part of me almost goes conspiracist about it and thinks it's deliberate. But I don't think that's actually true. There's something, though, that you hinted at in that question that I want to tease out a little bit. And by that, I mean when you were talking about the role of gender relations. And this is the subject of a book of yours I have not read, so I'm a little bit less knowledgeable on it. But you imply an ambiguity towards empire with feminism, with the developing feminisms after the first French Revolution. Can you expand on that a little bit and how maybe it's related to this commune stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So so in Feminism's Empire, I talk about basically what I do is I was looking for the first French feminists who were interested in wrote about, but also traveled into empire in the latter half of the 19th century. And so they, up until, and at the point of right on the eve of the commune, or even the commune itself, amongst the left, the French left, in terms of anarchist, socialist, feminists, virtually no one paid attention to imperialism. It just kind of wasn't on their radar. And then Louise Michel, Léonie Rousseau, there's several feminists who then take positions on empire, right? They become anti-imperialist, but they become anti-imperialist in terms of their opposition to existing forms of empire. And so I found 5 feminists who were the first to engage with empire, and then sort of conveniently, they fall on the range of feminisms in the time period, ranging from, on the far left, Louise Michel, who was a revolutionary anarchist feminist, and then ranging back to Olympe Audouard, who was a monarchist feminist, a liberal monarchist feminist. And so they engage questions of empire, they travel into empire, they oppose the way France does empire, and in many cases, the way that Britain or the United States does empire, but in different ways. Most of them think that there's some value in the imperial form. So Louise Michel and Paul Menck, who they're both communards. So they're both veterans of the Commune. And they are both self-described anti-imperialist. And they are closer to being what we would think of as anti-imperialist. But ultimately, this work that I've done has made very clear to me that it is impossible to talk about a clear dichotomy between pro-imperialist and anti-imperialist at this time. And so, and it varies. So there's one of these feminists, Hubertine Auclair, who is the head of the women's suffrage movement in France in the late 19th century. The women's suffrage movement is very small. I mean, this is, after the Commune, right? So that then, and she would not have been a communard if she had been old enough. I don't think. And so she's a socialist, but she's not a revolutionary. She's, very much, advocating the women's suffrage. And she lives in Algeria for a period of time, and she decides that France doesn't deserve the Algerian colony because it is disenfranchising half of its population, women, and that if France enfranchised women, that women would then elevate the entire level of society. They would then treat the Algerians more equitably. I mean, she's a kind of an essentialist take on what women would do. And this would then elevate the whole Algerian population, and they would then be able to be more French, which she argued that everyone wanted to be, that Algerians really wanted to assimilate and be more French. And so she advocated a feminist imperialism. So they're using these kind of imperial concepts of, their racialization, exoticization, kind of Orientalism to advance their politics, while at the same time opposing all existing imperial forms.
So I guess to tie it back into the Commune for our focus today, one thing that strikes me as a little odd historically is, why is the Commune, after the Commune, when this relationship to imperialism becomes clear? Because you have a lot of controversies and declines and collapses here and there, and the entirety of the period between, let's say 1790s through the 1870s. Why was it not on the map of these radicals?
France was not as aggressively imperialist until the Third Republic. And there had been different earlier in the period of the French Revolution and the several decades in its aftermath, there were utopian socialists, for example, in the first part of the 19th century, who were very much pro imperialist, that they really thought that they could bring their politics into to Egypt and to, other places that were either in the French Empire or just, in other empires, and that they could, in their case, elevate the status of women and of all of the people in these colonies. They really advocated colonization, but with their specific politics. There were liberals who advocated empire as a way of elevating the situation of indigenous people, and there were conservatives who opposed empire because they thought that indigenous peoples were not worthy of that kind of resources and elevation. And then there were economists that opposed empire. And so what I argue is that the feminists are the first to impose empire because they're actually they're approaching it from a kind of a view of exploitation and looking at imperialism as a kind of economic, racial, social, gender exploitation. And they see it first. I mean, Louise Michel is, along with 4,500 other communards, is sent to the French prison colony in New Caledonia in the South Pacific. And 4,500 communards, 25 of whom were women, not 2,500, 25. And her experience there really alters her politics. The Kanak people in New Caledonia are what the French have categorized as Melanesian, and that term is used now as Polynesia. In the South Pacific is divided into Polynesia and Melanesia, and it's based on skin color, and where Melanesians are black. And the French considered the Melanesians, along with sub-Saharan Africans, to be the lowest of their imperial subjects because they're black, and it was a very clear kind of racial hierarchy. And so Louise Michel gets to New Caledonia, and she has an extraordinary kind of optimism. She's sent, it's a almost 4-month ship voyage, and the prisoners are sent in cages, large cages, but they're cages. And she's writing about it, on the ship on the way there, saying this is exciting and an opportunity to see and learn new things. And so she gets there, and she's extremely interested in the Kanak people and their culture and their languages. They have 26 languages, and whereas the French, do not recognize them as having culture, do not recognize them as, barely as human. And she sees what the French government has done, and she is in this, she is experiencing colonialism and imperialism, and she develops a real critique of it based on her ideology and her experience.
So to take it back to the commune for a second, there's a key political concept that I think is useful, but takes a little bit of teasing out because it doesn't sound as radical as it actually ends up being when you say social republic. That doesn't sound to the American ear particularly shocking. But it's a pretty radical concept, and its success or failure in 1871, and obviously failure, leads to a series of debates. The most famous ones are between Marx and Blanqui and Marx and Bakunin, about what socialists should do in the future and what radicals and anarchists should do in the future. But I think to understand that a little better, because there's some scary terms that come out of this, like dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a whole different 2-hour episode that I'm going to have to do eventually. That you kind of have to understand the concept of social republicanism to get what specifically they were meaning by it at the time. So I guess there's 2 questions here. What is social republicanism, but what were women's contributions to the concept?
Okay, so the social republic was the idea that not only should there be political equity, but the government should be responsible for a kind of social equity. So it's kind of what we would think of as a social safety net, or a kind of 20th century socialist welfare state, but sort kind of taken to a larger, more extensive degree. But very much that the government is not about only that democracy and the republic, the representative government, is not just about people having this equal representation, but very much about wages, standards of living, equal access to education, all of these other factors that make up the society, and this is where the term socialism comes from. So feminists were very much interested and concerned with these issues, and especially the feminists that were Republican feminists, Republican socialist feminists, who were not looking for revolution. They were looking for a more gradual change, often a parliamentary move towards socialism, that you could, move away from, you can ameliorate the kinds of conditions that capitalism and patriarchy created by instituting different kinds of programs, including things like making access to equal education for girls and equal wages for women, introducing things like within the law, paternity searches were illegal under the Napoleonic Code. So if a woman got pregnant by a man to whom she was not married, she had zero legal recourse to get any kind of support or recognition at all. It was against the law. I mean, when the Napoleonic Code, I mean, the levels of misogyny are pretty extensive. So there are things like that, sort of recognizing the realities of people's lives, and specifically women's lives. And this is one of the things where a number of revolutionary socialist and revolutionary anarchist feminists, even after the Commune, they were not interested in the vote because they thought the vote was just sort of a little tiny crumb, like a crumb. It's like, okay, you can vote, you can have political representation, but that does not change our ability to house ourselves, house children, feed children, the kind of the reality, the social and economic realities of life.
I guess that leads me to a little bit more specific question that it was part of the question I asked a while back about, why it seems so opaque. But I find that most people, when they learn about the Commune, actually learn about the Commune in terms of the debates that we just talked about, the debates of how to deal with things beyond the social republic, between Marx and Bakunin and Marx and Blanqui and the First International, etc. And I have wondered if the focus on the debates afterwards have led to misconceptions about the actual event. And whether or not that's the cause of misconceptions, I'm certain there are tons of misconceptions about the Paris Commune because I've talked to people about it. What are some of the key misconceptions about the Paris Commune, and what led to those misunderstandings, and how have they affected political literature, but maybe also scholarly literature?
Right. Well, the largest misconception was that women were not integral participants. Louise Michel was the only communard woman that anyone had paid any attention to for over a century, really. And there was one book written in the early 60s by a woman who had been, she was a communist, French communist, and a member of the French resistance, Edith Thomas, about les pétroleuses, so the women incendiaries, the women who were blamed for burning Paris. But and then after that book, most books on the Commune would have a little paragraph about women, maybe Louise Michel. So, but that's also the story, the historiography of the history of most historiography, women were written out, and the concept of gender as a tool of historical analysis didn't exist until the 80s. So I think the biggest thing is that it was this kind of masculine only revolution, and then at the end, women fought on the barricades and were shot. And then always the recognition of women participating in day one on March 18th. But otherwise, I mean, different things, happen. There has been, I think, an inordinate focus on the commune government, the commune council, because it's recognizable. And this is in terms of the way scholars look at it, or many scholars have looked at it, as well as just, an average person reading. They were elected, and that's legible, right? That's the government. But one of the things that I really emphasize in the brief history is the fact that the commune is it's a real experiment in direct democracy, and there are multiple levels and centers of power. And I think that really, really has gotten, overlooked. I mean, I'm not the first person to say it, but it has really gotten overlooked. And I think it's vital to understand the significance of it, because that is distinctive. That kind of government, governing system, I don't even want to say structure. Well, what happened during the commune, the way it was developing, was pretty extraordinary in the way that there was this radical democracy. So I think those are the biggest misconceptions. And then in the 20th century, the French Communist Party totally appropriated Louise Michel and wrote about her as this kind of saintly figure, and she clearly was truly selfless. Like, anytime anyone gave her something, she gave it away and all that. But it was like sort of a saintly, almost like a secular nun or something. And then, of course, the name that she was given, the Red Virgin, which is, I could talk about that for a while. The idea that she was not married. She she lived with a woman for a long time, and so the people who criticized her would write about her having tastes against nature, and but then for the communists and for the people who were her supporters, long after she's dead, is this idea of the Red Virgin, that she's married to the revolution, and it reduces her to some kind of desexualized yet sexualized stereotype, so I mean, she has been kind of interpreted and appropriated in so many different ways, the vast majority of which has erased the pretty extraordinary level of her intellect and her abilities. And this is something that I write about in Feminism's Empire. This is, she's her time in New Caledonia, where she is a self-taught ethnographer, and she also becomes a linguist. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary, her language studies. She's trying to find the originary human language, and she has notebooks of language fragments, and then also the Kanak, with 26 languages, have a trade language that they use amongst themselves. And she sees this as an ideal universal language at the time of Esperanto. So this is the time, there's Esperanto. And there's also, I didn't know about this until I did this research, but Esperanto was one of many kind of created universal languages. And Michel is seeing this Kanak language of Bishlamar as an organic language, and trying to say this is another reason that they are more civilized and advanced than Europeans. She balances it out, right? And she does not escape some Western stereotypical language, and calling the Kanak childlike and etc. It's it's a very complex complex thing, her position. But so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing about Louise Michel when I'm also recently was talking to Ben Lewis about a similar problem with Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai. And there is a history to turn these like 3 or 4 major female figures, and notice that I said 3 or 4 major female figures when undoubtedly there were more, but these are the ones we talk about, into very specific codified little, capsule biographies that people can throw out. And Rosa Luxemburg's also an obvious example of this. And yet the knowledge of what they were actually doing and how much they wrote isn't around. And with someone like Zetkin, in particular, a lot of her work has not been translated into English, even though German is pretty easy to translate into English, as you would think. And so I'm imagining this is also true with a lot of these French women you're talking about. So,
oh yeah,
it's fascinating how much of this stuff we're just like, whatever. I often joke that, and it's a joke that is sincere, but and I don't mean to diminish the status of Urdu poetry from the 9th century, but sometimes I can find Urdu poetry from the 9th century easier than I can find some of these political writings from Europeans in a related language. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, like, this stuff is just not translated, right? Their writings are so rarely translated, and not only that. So Louise Michel also wrote novels and poetry, and she was an artist, and many of her novels they were published, when she was alive, and in really limited editions, and they are only in the last decade, barely, I don't even think it's a decade, have been really in the years building up to the 150th anniversary of the Commune last year, been, reissued in French with interesting introductions. The scholar Claude Reta has published a number of Michel's novels with a really great analytical introductions in French. But I mean, you couldn't get them in French, let alone English.
Yeah, that's wild. I guess this is a good place to talk about the Union des Femmes, because it's pretty crucial in your work on the Commune. And when I read your first book, it's pretty much what it's about. As you said, originally your dissertation was on that. And so I guess this is kind of a multi-part question. What is the Union des Femmes? How did it contribute to the Commune? And what was their role in the revolutionary period around that time in general?
Okay. So the Union des Femmes, it's so in Surmounting the Barricades, I use these 3 different women to talk about the different kinds of socialist feminisms that developed in the Commune. And the Union des Femmes was founded by Elizabeth Dmitrieff, who was a very young, 20 years old, Russian woman who had she left Russia to be able to go to university because there was no law in Russia against women attending university until the 1860s, which was a period of kind of intellectual ferment and radical activism, and women started attending university lectures, and then they passed a law against women attending universities. So she had some resources. She went to Geneva to study, and she was involved in starting she started the Russian emigre branch of the First International. And then she was in correspondence with Marx, and then she went to London and lived with one of his daughters and was talking with him a lot. I mean, she and Leo Frankel are the only 2 communards, I think, who read Marx at this point, because he was not translated into French. So Dmitrieff is in London, and the Commune begins, and Marx is looking for kind of eyes and ears to send, and the first person he wanted to send didn't work, and so I'm pretty certain he asks her to go, and she goes, and then fairly quickly decides that she's not going to just be his eyes and ears, she's going to stay, and she's going to participate, and she is going to create this women's union. And so she immediately contacts women who are involved in labor activism, and then she contacts members of the International, who she has, known through the international network, and she puts out a call for women workers, and she does research into the existing trades, women's trades in Paris, and she does this, quickly, this really kind of extraordinary survey of all of the different kinds of trades that women do. And she calls for women to join this association, and they do. And it ultimately becomes the largest organization during the Commune. It has, it meets in almost every arrondissement. There's 20 different sections of Paris, and all of them except for the most bourgeois. And it has two goals. The full name is in English is the Union of Women for the Defense of Paris and Aid to the Wounded. The main goal, though, is the reorganization and revaluation of women's labor, creating producer-owned cooperatives. And so she's not trying to change the gender division of labor. She's trying to have women who already have these skills have control over the conditions of their labor and their income. So producer-owned cooperatives, and which is not Marxist, right? So she's also influenced by the Russian peasant commune. And these are actually discussions she had with Marx about the Russian peasant commune compared, with his ideas. And she gets the commune government to give them financial support, places to meet. And so their long-term goal, that they're also working on immediately, is this reorganization, revaluation of women's labor. And the short term, they are working to defend the revolution, the city, because the Commune, the 72-day Revolutionary Civil War, I don't think I even said this, Paris is under siege. Mm-hmm. When that March 18th happens, the French National Army pulls out of the city because the soldiers were almost all Parisian. And so they sit and they wait and they bring in soldiers from the provinces, because historically the kind of antipathy between Paris and the provinces is pretty significant. Mm-hmm. And so they bring in provincial soldiers who already think that, are not fond of the Parisians at all. And then they lay siege to the city and then work on, ultimately crashing in through the city's still walled at this point, getting into the gates and slaughtering people. In the final bloody week. So the Union des Femmes is, they have someone, 24 hours a day at their post at each arrondissement. And then, Dmitriev is working to create these producer-owned cooperatives. And the documents that she created are extraordinary. The organizational documents and the way the structure of the organization is very top-down. And so she has a very much of a top-down kind of feminist socialism. She is running the show. She really lays this stuff out. She is, there's an executive commission. She is the head of it. And it is very different than, for example, the political clubs that are formed across the city. Many are mixed sex, some are just men and some are just women. And those are grassroots, ground up, more in many ways, more radical than the Union des Femmes. And the Commune government is actually much less comfortable with them too. So it's a very different kind of approach to socioeconomic and political reorganization. So the Union des Femmes is really significant. And it also had been sort of written out of history, despite its size and its impact.
I immediately think about the number of women who corresponded with Marx, arguing with him one way or the other to convince him about taking the Russian peasants' commune seriously, because there's more than one, and it's usually women who are engaging him in that, and they move him actually. Depending on who he's interacting with, he will make concessions. And I don't know. I think there's a book there for somebody. But yeah. You probably need to read Russian and French and German, but still. So I guess
no problem.
yeah. I guess that leads us to some of the other people in your book. Let's talk a little bit about Andre Leo. I hope I pronounced that right. I tend to butcher French names. I apologize about that.
It's pretty good with Leo. It's very close. So yeah, so she's actually one of the three women in Surmounting the Barricades. And then, she's, I talk a fair amount about her in the brief history. So Andre Leo is a very successful novelist. And during the period of the Second Empire, she publishes quite a few novels that engage political questions, but do so, under the, guise of being they're novels, right? So you can say various things. And this was the way that you could have a critique during a period of censorship. And her novels very much critique gender hierarchies, gender order, gender roles. And she's a socialist. And before the Commune, she is working for women to have the vote. And then when the Commune begins, she sort of shifts away from that because of this sort of the sense that, well, it's the new order. She edits a newspaper. She is a journalist. She very much, talks about the importance of women being able to have much broader access to all venues of life, including the battlefield during the Commune. And she writes an article called "The Revolution Without Women," and basically says that because historically France has ignored, marginalized women in revolutionary times, that many women have turned away from revolutionary politics and have basically gone back to the church, because there's this, especially after 1848, religion and revolutionism are an opposite ends of things. And so this is, Leo's real contribution is the pen, and she publishes, really regularly during the Commune, and she also had been a member of the International. There quite a few of these communard women were involved with the International before and during and after the Commune.
And so I guess that the last figure in Surmounting the Barricades that you write a fair amount about is a Palamink.
Yes.
And the Club East. So maybe let's talk about that a little bit as well, and the relationship of the church, because I think it's also going to play into the aftermath.
Yeah. So that's, what I was mentioning in contrast to the Union des Femmes, the women in the political clubs. So the political clubs had first formed during the Franco-Prussian War. Before the Commune, right before the Commune, Prussia had laid siege to Paris. So the Commune is actually the second siege, like in a year, which is extremely brutal on the Parisians, as you can imagine. And so during the Prussian siege of Paris, working class men and women formed political clubs, and they met in churches. They appropriated space in churches. And so after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and then there's this, the period of the between that and the Commune. And then once the Commune begins, they start up the political clubs again, and many new political clubs are formed. And this is really the most grassroots kind of politics. And the anti-clericalism is really intense. I mean, first of all, they're in the physical space of the church. An interesting thing, I think, is that in many cases, the political clubs would meet in the evening, and during the day, the churches were churches. So they didn't bar the flock from coming into the churches. They didn't throw the priests out, though the rhetoric, the anti-clerical rhetoric was really quite violent. Amongst the women, amongst men too, but very much so. It's the fact that it was the women saying things like, we must kill the priests, and tear their tongues out, and this kind of thing was seen as especially shocking because it's not just anti-clerical; it's it's considered as profoundly inappropriate female behavior. But the political clubs were across the city, and the majority of the participants are working class, although a number of the more high-profile feminists and socialists also participated in these clubs, including Paul Mink. And in Surmounting the Barricades, I kind of use each of the, Leo, Mink, and Dmitriev as an exemplar of a particular kind of socialist feminism. And so with Mink, it is these political clubs, and they're truly grassroots kind of nature.
So I suppose there's two things that occur to me immediately after this. So we talked a little bit about where some of these go after the communes dispersed and more or less crush. And it also seems like there's, kind of semi-anti-imperial blowback that happens because of the New Caledonia exile, and a lot of these, I think Dmitriev becomes an immigrant again after this. There's a whole lot of movement, but there's two things that I kind of want to pierce out from like broad trends. One is how are women used as propaganda to delegitimize the commune's memory or socialism as a force in France and in Europe in general? Are they used this way? I mean, it feels like they almost certainly were, but what's the nature of the backlash against this?
Okay, well, women are blamed for burning the city in the final week of Paris. So there's this final bloody week. This is once the French army breaks into the city. And then there is conflict in the streets. This is the period of the barricades. This is people build barricades. They tear up paving stones, drag furniture, books, break window frames, and they just pile up whatever they can pile up. And then they fight from behind it. And this had gone on in the earlier revolutions also. And then the city is on fire. And it's a combination of the artillery shooting into the city from the French National Army and communards lighting buildings up. And it is not the vast majority of women who are lighting these buildings on fire. This is sort of like the various kind of key institutional buildings are burned by the communards, and it's not 100% clear who did what. But women are blamed for this, and they're called les pétroleuses, or the women incendiaries, petrol, gas. Mm-hmm. And because this is happening during this final week when there are soldiers in the city and they're shooting people at alarming and extraordinary rates, any woman who is seen with like a bucket, or a child who's seen with a bucket, is considered guilty because the assumption is they have petrol, even though they probably had milk in the bucket, and so they are shot, and bodies are piled in the streets. And this idea of the pétroleuse it's a reflection of the fact that during the Commune, not just class hierarchies but gender hierarchies were very much inverted. And this is terrifying to the powers that be, to the bourgeoisie. They are, seeing a complete inversion of the world that they are very comfortable with, the hierarchies with which they are comfortable. And so this causes the death of in God knows how many women and children, and then this legacy and this blame is laid on women, and that pretty much sticks around into the 20th century. This idea that women, were responsible for this, and that their furies. I mean, the political cartoons are really fascinating and horrifying. Gay Gullickson wrote a book in the 90s called, oh my God. I can't believe I can't think of the name. I'm sorry. But anyway, she talks about representations of communard women and really analyzes a lot of these political cartoons and unruly women of Paris. And it's just really clear that they're shrews. They're seen as hideous, ugly. Carrying the bucket of petrol, and it's a terrifying image because the people who were very happy with the status quo are indeed terrified by what has happened. During the Bloody Week, when people who weren't shot on the spot are marched to prisons outside of the city, either in Versailles or in Satoris, another prison. And so you have these lines of prisoners and these kind of horrible long marches. And there are these reports of bourgeois women, hitting them with their umbrellas. And there's this real physical kind of violence because these women are so angered at the way that communard women have enacted womanhood, really, and what they have done, and then as well as what they think they have done in terms of the kind of blame and stereotypes that are laid on them.
Well, I guess let's talk about the flip side of that a little bit. We talked a little bit about this already, but maybe to go in more broad terms, what is the legacy of the women of the Commune on other women's movements in France in the next 150 years? I mean, Louise Michel is a big part of that, but probably portrayed as too much of a part of that, honestly. But how is the other end of this, the positive end, kind of represented in French radical memory?
Well, I mean, the Commune plays a really significant role in the French radical memory in terms of women and just in terms of the Commune itself, and beyond, well beyond France too. I mean, the Commune is sort of seen as this golden moment of the left in so many ways, and for many decades it was barely Louise Michel and nothing else really, and that the women were, as I said before, pretty much erased. And amongst certainly in more recent decades, there's really this kind of recognition of an increasing and growing recognition of women's participation in the Commune, but it's really pretty recent. It really is, because it just, as I said, there was a book by A.D. Thomas in 1963, which was translated into English, I think, maybe around 1980 or something. And then there was a British scholar, Eugene Schulkind, who had written a couple of articles, maybe as far back as the 50s. I haven't seen them in a while. I mean, he died a while ago, but 50s and into the 60s and 70s. Yeah, definitely 70s at least. And, with a fairly, sophisticated kind of analysis, and then just a few more things. And then Gay Gullickson's book and my book. And I mean, there just hasn't been much. And so the available person is Louise Michel, sort of the available to the kind of radical imaginary in terms of women's participation, but that's expanded, in the last couple of decades, I would say, in terms of both scholarship and amongst activists.
Yeah, I think a lot about this in terms of radical history and whatnot, because I've taught classes on social movements to actually Korean students, and to Korean college students, and to high school students here in the States. And even knowledge of U.S. social movements and feminism before the 1960s is pretty low. I mean, it seems to a lot of people's popular imagination, feminism sort of, happens in the 19th century. There's Seneca Falls, then nothing, and then the 60s happen, and then nothing, and then the 80s and 90s happen. And that's a lot of students' kind of perception of it. But I was actually thinking explicitly about how little even I, who study radical history, do a show on it, have heard about some of this stuff in France. And you would think, well, France isn't that far away from English-speaking world. It's kind of a parallel radical tradition, parallel revolutionary tradition. You think we'd know about it, if only to demonize it even, but not even that. So it's kind of fascinating to me. I guess that, I would ask you the question of why, although it's somewhat obvious, we just don't pay enough attention to women, particularly radical women, particularly, in particular. And I guess maybe the question I might have, though, is why do you think that the official socialist movements haven't been that great on this either?
Because they're
mostly dudes.
Sexist.
Yeah,
they're sexist. I mean, really, that's it. I mean, it's that's the way things are getting better, right? Things have gotten better over the last couple of decades, but I mean, even when I was, at the beginning of graduate school, especially, it was just anything, about gender, feminism was, marginalized in the socialist scholarship and amongst socialist scholars. I mean, I certainly had, nobody said don't do what you're doing, but I wrote that dissertation without a super lot of help from so and I mean I got some help from feminist scholars who were outside of where I was studying, but there's just it's old school patriarchy and sexism to various degrees, whether on the super aggressive level, like the history of the the anti-war movement in the United States, which is just riddled with misogyny, sexism, to more kind of passive, well, yeah, I'm sure there were women doing something, but not recognizing that if you don't understand the role of gender and you don't understand what everybody there was doing, you're not really understanding a context. You're misunderstanding it. So,
yeah, that's always fascinating to me, because I think about the two most read socialist books in the 19th and early 20th century are August Bebel's Women and Socialism and Kautsky's Road to Power. Okay, Kautsky's Road to Power is not relevant here, but it says a lot that even though it's not by a woman, it's not an unproblematic text, but that the number one selling, social, not that maybe we should judge socialist works by sales, but the number one read socialist work of the 19th century is a book about women and is a relatively feminist work for a lot of the other stuff coming out of the socialist movement by men at the time.
Relatively, yes. Yeah.
It has to be couch, but and yet even that book, I don't know many socialist scholars now even really talking about Bebel, and I'm always but that's one of the two most read socialist books of the period. It's definitely more read than anything Marx wrote at that time. And so I find that tension fascinating. I also find that it's still true in socialist movements. And when you talk about socialist feminism, I can see, the broa spirit is everywhere in almost every subcategory of life. And even as a man myself, it's one of these things that I'm like, I'm a little bit taken aback by, actually, because I'm like, I don't know. I was kind of raised to believe we were supposed to be better about this, but yeah, it's interesting. I think the translation, realizing how few of these women's works have been translated in English, how few of even the socialist feminist in English before the 1970s are read. That's another big one. Discussing some of the weird positions, like the debates between like Zedkin and Elizabeth Nesbit, for example, which is a weird example. But like there's a lot of this, and when I talk about this to groups of socialists, I usually get blank stares. They've just never heard of it, and so it's kind of worrying.
Yeah. It's like anarchists, where they don't know that Proudhon was a raging misogynist. They don't know because they're not taught that, or on the more sort of liberal, classic liberal kind of political science courses that teach all about Rousseau, but don't recognize his incredible misogyny, where you just like leave out a central element in a scholar's or a thinker's intellectual and ideological formation. I mean, misogyny is central to Rousseau, and misogyny is central to Proudhon. And if you don't know that, you're missing something big. But that's it, because it's just like oh well, we're not going to talk about that.
Fair enough. I do think people should read your books, and just in general read more about women's roles in socialism and in the revolution. I think like I'm always fascinated by how little I've read about Vera Zurlik, who seems pretty important considering some of the stuff that she witnessed and what she got as concessions from Marx and letters that ended up being important in understanding things later on. And yet, again, not a lot of people know that much about her. And so I would definitely start with this. Your book on your first book on the Commune was the first time I'd heard of most of this. I read it about 10 years ago, but like I had not heard of hardly any of this stuff. And I felt pretty silly. So
well, I mean, unless you're doing the research yourself, I mean, I wrote it because it wasn't written, so you can't, I mean, and it was just translated into French in 2020 and published, which was for me like a real triumph to get my interpretation of French history into French, so that, because most educated French people can read English, but they won't, at least not French history in English. And so and it was published by Éditions de la Sorbonne, so very legit. And it was reviewed more than Surmounting the Barricades was when it came out in English. And so the French were very interested in it, and still are. I mean, sadly, it came out like at the moment of the pandemic. I mean, it came, March of 2020. It was terrible. It was like it took months to get out of the warehouse physically. But I mean, that book coming out in French was one of the first books to talk about women and gender in the Commune in French. I mean, now in the last couple of years, literally the last couple of years, because of the anniversary, there's really been an amazing kind of, fluorescence of work on women and gender in the Commune in French. But, in 2004, when Surmounting the Barricades came out, there was very little. So you shouldn't,
I guess I shouldn't beat myself up too bad, but I should beat my tradition up.
Yeah. That you can do. Yeah.
It is wild to sometimes feel like we're focusing on the 50s, 60s, and 70s as the origins for a lot of socialist feminism, Marxist feminism realized, no, there's a good 150 year history before that we just don't know.
Yeah. And in the French context, you can trace back the sort of liberal feminist tradition to the women of 1789 and the radical feminist tradition to the women of 92, 93. I mean, they come out, these, you can just trace it back. And, it's, they didn't disappear. Those traditions just didn't disappear between the revolutions. As you were saying about the, average kind of American students, if they know anything about feminism, they know it's like the waves, right? And the 1848, they don't recognize that there were socialist feminists. They also, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were socialists. I mean, they were also, they're in recent years a scholarship, and they were racist and there were all sorts of problems, but they were socialists, and that has completely been, erased because it doesn't fit in with the American narrative.
Right.
Also, for many reasons, not the least in the United States, the kind of Cold War idea of, socialism being kind of socialism, communism, fascism is all the same, that which again is, indicative of a pretty poor, a pretty strong level of propaganda and pretty poor, education counterbalancing it.
Yeah. Teaching English, I'm always teaching Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and people tend to think that it's like begins and ends with the yellow wallpaper and that there's no other politics involved. I'm like, no, this woman's a socialist. There's a whole lot going on here, both positive and negative. It's complicated, but it's there. It's a lot more than just complaining about how sexist doctors were, which was probably fair to complain about. But it's probably still fair to complain about, let's be honest. But there's a lot more stuff there than we teach, and these are the names people would know. We're not even dealing with the names that don't.
Right.
So
absolutely.
And that's in English. So when you get into French, and I've been fascinated with the German example. I mean, I've known about Clara Zetkin for like 15 years, but I did not realize till very recently that like 70% of her stuff is untranslated into English at all, and it's very strange. And her positions are not what I always would have thought either. So it's kind of important to understand this. I think if these feminist traditions, I think are also more complicated than people are. And I like that you use the term feminisms because there's a lot of them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's super important. Yep.
And they don't fit into those waves very neatly the way it's commonly understood.
Yeah.
Here.
Not at all. So, yeah. No. And here, and the waves here don't really reflect the reality of U.S. feminisms either. It's a real reduction of the reality. So. Yeah.
The waves here are very, very packed. So I thank you for coming on the show. People should read your books. Anything else you'd like to plug?
No, I think that's it really. Feminism's Empire, Cornell University Press, and Paris Commune Brief History, Rutgers University Press, both reasonably priced and available in many places. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you.